So our Bible reading this week was Proverbs 23 through 31, the book of Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon, chapters 1 through 4. Now, before we get into that, we're going to cover those here shortly. We do have our memory verse. They have updated it to the correct one now, the correct version. Psalm 125, verse 1. Repeat it with me, please. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved, but abides forever. All right. So, as we look at the book of Proverbs, we want to wrap up in the book of Proverbs today. And when we're reading the book of Proverbs, we talked about this last week, there's really kind of two groups of the Proverbs. There's the group that is very contextual, and you have long sections of a proverb where you have a lot of context. Those are primarily Proverbs 1 through 9, but you also have something very similar in Proverbs chapter 31. The rest of the Proverbs tend to be mostly very short statements of wisdom and admonition. You might have some that are 2 or 3 verses, occasionally 4 verses, but it's rare. Most of them are just one verse. And what we might think of when we think of a modern-day proverb. When we think of a modern-day proverb, we think of a sentence or two at the most to sum up some wise saying. Now, there were 2 concepts about Proverbs we talked about last week. I don't know if anybody remembers. Anybody remember the 2 concepts about Proverbs that we talked about last week that kind of apply to all Proverbs?
Maybe referring to the concept of their generality as far as their general principle.
Okay, that's the third one. We'll now add number 3, because that wasn't the one I was thinking of, but that is one of the things we mentioned last week, that they can be sort of generalized. They're not necessarily hard, fast principles that work every time, but they are general, for the most part, they're general principles that say, hey, for example, a soft answer turns away wrath. Does that mean that everybody that you talk to that's angry, that if you offer a soft answer, they're necessarily going to go, okay, I'm done, I'll calm down? Not necessarily. It's a general principle that if you return an answer with you return an angry answer with a soft answer, generally speaking, that's going to lower the temperature of the conversation. That's the idea. Doesn't mean every person that you say that to is going to respond correctly. So it's a generality. In most cases, that's going to be the case. That's one of the things. What was something else that we talked about? Anybody remember? That these are very practical. They're very, these are not really theoretical so much. They're very practical in their application. Again, that in and of itself is a generality, because we say, train up a child in the way in which he shall go, and in the end, when he's old, he will not depart from it. That's somewhat of a principle. It doesn't say, hey, here's all the details of how you train them. More specifically, might be the rod of correction. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will drive it far from him. That's a very practical principle. You got foolishness bound up in the heart of a child. Here's how you address that. Here's what you do about that. And so a lot of these are Proverbs tend to be very practical, everyday application kind of things. There was one other principle we talked about that was mentioned in chapter 1, kind of in the introduction, that Proverbs are an enigma or a riddle. And what does that suggest?
Kind of hidden meanings, or maybe not just on the face value, but a deeper.
So the meaning may not be the literal meaning that it sounds like. We talked about, and we're talking about it a little bit more this week. The lazy man says, "There's a lion in the streets." Well, he's not really saying here a lazy man goes and says there's a lion in the streets. Point is, lazy people make excuses. That's the point of the proverb. So sometimes you have to look beyond. Not always. Soft answer turns away wrath is pretty straightforward, isn't it? That's pretty. There's not really anything hidden in the meaning of that. But sometimes in these proverbs, you have to look a little deeper than the surface. And sometimes what you'll see in that, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because we're not doing a deep dive into Proverbs. An interesting study, if you ever go and do a deep dive in the study of Proverbs, is oftentimes you'll see parallel lines. What do we talk about when we talk about? Anybody remember from English class? Going to rack your brains a little bit here. Anybody remember what parallelism is when we talk about English? Anybody remember that?
say two lines that both basically mean the same thing.
Two lines that basically mean the same thing. We just talked about one. Proverbs are an enigma and a riddle. He's not saying they're two different things. He's saying the same thing just in two different ways. Okay? And sometimes one is meant to help explain the other. Sometimes it's the same thing said over again. Sometimes it's a building on the other. Sometimes it's an explanation of the other. But watch for that as you read the book of Proverbs. You'll see a lot of parallelism in some of these things in Proverbs. So, having said all that, let's look at a few things. We talked that just making sure my phone doesn't make any noises, so unfortunately that's where my notes are since I left my iPad at home, so bear with me just a moment. We talked about the fact that in Proverbs there are some themes that are somewhat recurring. You see some common things that get talked about a lot. Now, before I throw some out there, does anybody have anything that jumps out to you? I may have mentioned a couple last week. I don't remember. Anything that I remember seeing this a lot in the book of Proverbs. I see this over and over in the book of Proverbs. It stands out.
I was struck by how often it just refers to people as fools.
Okay.
It just acknowledges that there are fools out there and almost don't waste your time. Like, they're not going to understand.
That's absolutely right, and that's one that I think is really interesting. It's an interesting thing, and what is the contrast that's drawn in the book of Proverbs? The fool is referred to frequently. What is the contrast of the fool in the book of Proverbs?
The wise man.
The wise man. All right, now here's a question, and it's not a trick question, but it does require a little bit of thinking. Is the difference between the wise man and the fool just IQ level? In other words, the wise man really knows a lot, and the fool just doesn't have really good knowledge. Is that the difference between the wise man and the fool in the book of Proverbs? What's the difference between the wise man and the fool in the book of Proverbs?
The fool doesn't have the fear of the Lord.
Doesn't have fear of the Lord, that's one.
The fool doesn't listen and doesn't really respond to correction properly.
Doesn't listen in the sense of not responding to what they're taught, what they're told. Let's look at a couple of these. I have a couple of these I want to look at. Let's go through a few of these real quickly. We're not going to take a lot of time. And we are going to go back a little bit into some of the reading from last week. Chapter 10 and verse 8. And again, we're going to move through these fairly quickly. The wise of heart will receive commandments, but a babbling fool will come to ruin. What's the contrast here? The contrast is the wise man will hear instruction, commandments, and make changes based on that, whereas the fool will just babble on and do his own thing. And what's going to be the end result? Ruin. Again, it's not just about basic knowledge. It's about how you react to what you ought to know. Verse 14. The wise lay up knowledge, but the mouth of a fool brings ruin near. One of the interesting things, and we're going to talk about another one here in a minute, and some of these overlap. So, for example, this one and the concept of the tongue and what people say overlap frequently. You're going to see a lot about the difference between how the wise man acts and what the fool says. Because you see, the fool's a lot more willing to talk about things. The wise man's a lot more willing to listen. And so we see some overlap. But note that contrast as you read through the book of Proverbs. Note the contrast of the wise man is the one who listens, takes in instruction. The fool is the one who just talks on. He's got the answer for everything. 15, chapter 12, verse 15. The way of the fool, here's a really good one. The way of the fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. You want a kind of almost a definition of the difference between the wise and the fool? This is it. The idea that the fool, he thinks he's got all the answers. He thinks he knows everything. Doesn't matter what you tell him. Has anybody ever known anybody like that? It doesn't. And here's the thing about the fool. You know, sometimes in our society we like to throw around words like idiot and stupid, and those are really not, they're not really good conversational things, and really not things we ought to be throwing out. They're generally meant to be mean and derogatory. You really want to deal with what people are in most cases, biblically speaking. More often than not, they fit the definition of the fool. Think about how many people you've known. It doesn't matter what the topic is. You pick a topic. It doesn't matter. And they are an expert on that topic. They have something to say. They either have an experience, they've read something, they know something, but they have an answer. And if you try to contradict them, you're wrong. They know the answer. That's the fool. The fool is wise in his own eyes. He thinks he knows everything. You can't correct him. You can't teach him. And therein is the concept of the fool. Again, not just about whether or not you have knowledge. It's about what you do with that knowledge. That is the difference between the wise and the fool. All right. Just a couple more, and then we're going to move on to a different category. Let's look at one or two more. Chapter 18, verse 15. This one's more on the side of the wise. An intelligent heart acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. And then, last one, let's look at 19 and verse 20. And then we'll move on to another category. Listen to advice and accept instruction, that you may gain wisdom in the future. You know, the people I've known over the years that I've had the most respect for are those who, despite their age and knowledge, listen to others. There was a deal at work, and I don't often think they say a lot of things that really come out of biblical concepts, but there was something that was said in a discussion not long ago that I thought really kind of fit this concept. You know, sometimes when you go into a meeting, everybody wants to be the first to talk, right? And everybody wants to make sure they get their chance to put their 2 cents worth in. And the point that was made is sometimes the best thing to do and the smartest thing to do is just listen to what everybody else has to say before you open your mouth and have something to say. How hard is that? Let me say, the Proverbs are not necessarily easy to apply. They might be simple to understand. That's a simple concept to understand. It's not hard to understand what he's saying. Now, putting that into application, it's kind of like 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13, chapter of love, the principles there are fairly simple and straightforward. Now, when you go try to apply 1 Corinthians 13, it can get hard. Proverbs is similar. All right. Wisdom and fool, that's one. Anything else that stood out to somebody frequent in the book?
Discipline and child rearing.
Discipline and child rearing, absolutely. Well, let's look at a few of those. Goes all the way back as early as chapter 3 and verse 12. Let's just look at a few of these real quick. For the Lord reproves whom he loves as the Father, the Son in whom he delights. How many people have ever heard somebody say, I love my child too much to discipline him? I can't discipline him because I love him too much. Doesn't this verse teach exactly the opposite of that? We're familiar with, I'm sure you've all heard this example, it's not new. How many people who feel that way would watch their child run out into the street and get run over by a car because they didn't want to say, no, stop, don't run out in the street? We would all do that. Every parent would do that. Might even run out and try to grab them and yank them back, even if it hurts their arm, to try to save them from that danger. But when we talk about spiritual danger or moral danger, somehow our mentality becomes, oh, I'm hands off, I just let them be who they want to be. I love them too much to fix them. Proverbs says exactly the opposite. One second here. Get to where my screen won't go off every 3 seconds here. All right, there we go. All right, chapter 13, verse 24. Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. Now, I know there is a lot of disagreement even among brethren about what the rod is in this passage. Whether it is literally a physical rod and physical discipline. I've always believed that there is an amount of physical discipline that's taught in the book of Proverbs. Clearly, I don't think anything in the Bible, even in the book of Proverbs, teaches child abuse. But here's the thing. Whether you believe that this passage teaches physical discipline or not, I tell you what it does teach. It teaches that you have a responsibility to discipline in a way that will teach and instruct and change behavior. That's what it teaches. Whoever spares the rod hates his son. When you fail to discipline your child or grandchild, you are not demonstrating love according to this passage. You're doing exactly the opposite. And if you love him, you will discipline him not occasionally, not randomly, not when it's convenient, but diligently. It's an important word in that passage. An important lesson. Let me see if I've got the right verse here. 23, I think it's 14. Back up to verse 13. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with the rod, he will not die. If you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from Sheol. This again, as I just said a while ago, I do think it points to the idea of physical discipline, but I also think it points to the idea it's a physical discipline that's not doing critical physical damage. You're not beating your child in a way that does child abuse. Some say, well, if you believe in child discipline, if you believe in spanking, you believe in child abuse. No, don't at all. Any way, shape, or form. And neither does the Bible. Now, another interpretation of that verse is not that you won't kill him, but your child may think he's going to die because of the discipline that you're administering, which would suggest that it's a pretty significant discipline, whatever the discipline may be. Whatever you make that discipline to be, the child thinks it's pretty severe. You know, sometimes we discipline in a way that really doesn't make an impact on the child. Proverbs says you got to make an impact. You've got to get through to them in this. A couple more and then we'll move on. 19:18. And I'm kind of going back and forth because I had these sort of in groups of verses that sort of go together. 19:18. Discipline your son, for there is hope. Do not set your heart on putting him to death. And again, this can be interpreted two ways. Again, it comes to the idea of a proverb. You've got to kind of work through the meaning. Discipline your son, for there is hope. The idea of doing it early enough that there is hope. You wait to discipline your child till he's a teenager, you're way too late. You're way far behind. You're going to miss your window of opportunity. You need to start early while there is hope for changing the mentality and the behavior. And then do not set your heart on putting him to death. That can be, again, interpreted two ways. The discipline should not be such that it is physically destructive, but it can also be interpreted to mean you discipline him so that he will not follow the path to death. You try to help him avoid that path which leads to death. So again, important lessons. 22:15. We mentioned this one earlier. I quoted probably New King James. I'm reading from English Standard up here. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. Sometimes discipline takes some work, takes some effort, but it should have the impact that you desire. All right, and so there are some others, but for sake of time, we're not going to look at every one of them. If we look at every one of them, we won't have time to cover some others. Any other specific verses on parenting or child rearing that you wanted to mention before we move on to something else? Something else specific you had in mind before we move on to another category? All right. What's another category? Anybody stood out to somebody? Anything? Stephen?
What actions you can take to bring about poverty physically in your life versus the limitations of riches and kind of the use of riches and how those come about and that kind of thing. There's a lot of that also relates to work ethic and those kind of things too. They're kind of all blended together.
So and you've kind of mentioned two that I want to talk about. One is there is a lot in the book of Proverbs about wealth, and it's not all just, hey, go get rich. It's about how you use the wealth that you have. And how you might, if you're not careful, end up in poverty if you don't use your riches wisely. Let's look at a few of these. Chapter 11 and verse 4. Riches do not profit in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. So again, it's not all about, oh, go get rich. It's about, hey, don't put your trust in riches. That's not going to save you when judgment comes. Put your trust in being righteous before God. Okay? There's a lot of people who believe it's their wealth that's going to save them or protect them or whatever. Book of Proverbs says, no, that's not the case. All right? Verse 28. Whoever trusts in his riches will fall, but the righteous will flourish like a green leaf. Again, another contrast between putting your trust in riches and putting your trust in righteousness. Look at chapter 23 and verse 5. Need to back up to verse 4 in this. Do not toil to acquire wealth. Be discerning enough to desist. When your eye lights up on it, it is gone. For suddenly it sprouts wings, flying like an eagle toward heaven. Ever had that situation? Get so focused on riches, so focused on something important. And the next thing you know, it's gone. You don't have it anymore. I think a little bit of the rich fool in the book of Luke. But there's also just things in life, maybe somebody puts a lot of trust in a stock. Man, I'm gonna save until I have stock in this company. Next thing you know, how many people bought Enron the day before it went bust? How many people bought other stock the day before some tragedy was revealed and boom, it was gone? Put all your trust in that, and the next thing you know, it's gone. He said, don't focus on that. Don't get wrapped up and absorbed in that. Chapter 13 and verse 7. One pretends to be rich, yet has nothing. Another pretends to be poor, yet has great wealth. So sometimes people have a pretense of what they are. He talks about having a pretense. Don't judge everybody by just what you see. The best example I can think of that, and I never had a personal experience, obviously, but I heard tell that Sam Walton, the man who established Walmart, for those of you who don't know the name, drove around in an old truck, regular jeans, and would go to his stores, and if you saw him in the store, you wouldn't know who he was. You didn't have any idea who he was. Why does this matter? I think of the book of James. How do we treat people? Do we treat people based on what we perceive their wealth to be? How many people make it appear that they have a lot when really they have nothing? Because they want that adulation. They want that praise. They want those relationships that men offer because of the appearance of wealth. So I think the lesson here is be careful how you judge. It may look like somebody's wealthy and they really don't have anything, and vice versa. Chapter 22 and verse 1. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver and gold. Now, how many in our society would accept that principle? It's better to have good reputation and a good relationship with people than it is to be wealthy. The book of Proverbs says it is. Chapter 23 and verse 4. Oh, we already read that one. We looked at that one a moment ago. Look at 11:24. One or two more, and then we'll move on to another category. 11:24. One gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give, and only suffers want. That's an interesting one, isn't it? He says the greedy a lot of times actually end up suffering more than those who are free to give and help others. All right. Interesting lesson there. One more, then we'll move on. Let's look at 20. We already looked at that one. Sorry, I'm losing track. Let's look at 13:11. Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it. All right? So sometimes the quick found wealth goes away quickly. You want examples of that? Look at people who win the lottery. See where they are 5 years down the road. They never had wealth. They don't know what to do with it. The next thing you know, they spend it all and it's gone. Look at athletes. Go see how many stories you can find of athletes who made millions and millions of dollars in their span as an athlete that 5 years after they retire are broke. Don't have a penny to their name. They never learned how to handle it, what to do with it. Or they trusted the wrong people. So wealth gained quickly is not always great wealth. So says Proverbs. Again, is that always true? Does everybody who gets money quick waste it and is it gone? No, it's not always true. But as a general principle, there you go. Any other verses specifically on wealth and poverty or the attitude toward these things that you had in mind you wanted to call out before we move on to something else? Any other categories in Proverbs that stood out to you?
Use of our tongue.
The use of our tongue. Man, that is all over the book of Proverbs. And when I said something earlier about things that are easy to understand and difficult to apply, you talk about controlling the tongue. Go read the book of James. See what James says about the difficulty of controlling the tongue. Proverbs talks a lot about the tongue. Let's look at just a few of them again. Proverbs 10, verse 11. The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. Ever known anybody to just lie to cover up things? No, nobody do that, right? Nobody lie to protect themselves. This isn't about violence, but one of the funniest experiences I had in life. I don't know how many of you ever went through the experience in high school. When I was in high school, we'd have to go in the mornings. If you missed the day before, you have to go and stand in line with the secretary of your assistant principal, and you'd have to give them a note from your parents, say where you were the day before, and they'd either excuse or not excuse your absence. And so I went to school one day with an absence that said I was out with my parents' permission. I wasn't sick. They just said I had my parents' permission to be absent from school. Unexcused absence. You're not excused. So my dad goes to talk to the assistant principal and say, well, why isn't he excused? He's making great grades. He's not missing any of his work. He's done all his homework. Why can't this be an excused absence? Well, because it wasn't an illness or something like that. And my dad said, well, there were people in the line behind him who were talking about they'd gone to a party or they'd gone to have fun the day before, and their parents just wrote them a note to lie to say they were sick so they get an excused absence. The assistant principal literally told my dad, well, people wouldn't lie about that. How do you not understand? People will lie about stuff like that. I mean, we heard them lying about it. People will lie to protect themselves. Sometimes in very severe situations, sometimes over minor things. Another one, chapter 11, verse 9. With his mouth the godless man would destroy his neighbor, but by knowledge the righteous are delivered. You ever know anybody to spread lies with the intent of destroying somebody else? You ever heard of politics? Spread something you know is not true to do harm to someone else. Here's a trick, though. You don't have to be in politics for people to do that. Sometimes people do it in business. Two people vying for a job, somebody lies about the other one so they can get the job instead of the other person. Maybe they lie about themselves, make themselves look better. People lie to do harm to others. Would that ever happen? Proverbs says it will. Chapter 16, verse 24. Gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. I think that's an interesting one when you stop and think about it. Have you ever been in a situation in life, or maybe yourself or somebody else you know, and maybe they're really having a hard time? I don't know what they're facing. Maybe it's financial, maybe it's family, maybe it's something else. And just the words that somebody offers, the fact that somebody notices and cares and says something. I know it means a lot to me when we get the cards from Member Care. Because somebody noticed. Somebody cared that we weren't there. Somebody cared that we were going through a hard time or that we were sick or whatever the case may be. Words can have such power. You don't always have to send an expensive set of flowers. Or something. Sometimes it's just picking up the phone. Sometimes just sending an email. Sometimes just dropping a card in the mail. But words can have a very powerful effect in a positive way as well as negative. How about chapter 12 and verse 8? A man is commended according to his good sense, but one of twisted mind is despised. Not specifically referencing the tongue in that one. Let me look for the next one. 15 and verse 4. Okay, I think I've got those in the wrong category somehow. 15:28. The heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. Ponders how to answer. How many times, I'm not asking anybody to raise your hands because I'd have to raise mine, but how many times somebody done or said something and you just, you've got a lightning quick answer, and the minute you say it, you go, I really wish I hadn't said that. Righteous ponder. Let me stop. Let me think. And maybe it's not just what we say in tongue. Maybe it's what we shoot off in an email. Maybe it's what we shoot off in a text. Here's an interesting little note for you. I've learned this recently. iPhone now has a really neat little feature that you can unsend a message. Here's the thing about that, though. A lot of times people already have seen the message in the notification, so even though you unsend it, they might have already seen it. Something to think about when you're ready to shoot that message off and think, oh, wait, maybe I shouldn't have said that. One or two more and then we'll move on. 16:23. We talked about that one earlier. Good sense is a fountain of life to him who has it, but the instruction of fools is folly. What I don't have on here, I've sworn I did, and maybe I've got it somewhere else. I might have it under the one about the fool, is the one that talks about how a fool opens his mouth and confirms that he's a fool. Everybody thinks he's okay until he opens his mouth. Well, sometimes we do that, don't we? Sometimes people think we're okay until we open our mouth and prove that we're really not maybe what we'd like everybody to believe that we are. All right. I have two more here. See if anybody hits on those. If not, I'll mention them real quick. And then we've got a few minutes left to move on to Ecclesiastes. I'm going to save Song of Solomon. We'll talk about it a little bit next week. I'm not going to spend a ton of time in the Song of Solomon. We'll talk about it a little bit next week. Finish up a few more minutes in Proverbs, and then we'll move into Ecclesiastes. Anybody have one or two more that you noticed as frequent in the book of Proverbs? So, yes.
Righteousness versus wickedness.
Righteousness versus wickedness. I don't have that particular set of verses in my group, but that's certainly a good one. JD?
I'm not sure how well an answer this is, but one thing that stuck out to me was when wisdom was personified as someone who seeks you out, but if you turn your back on her because it's personified as a woman, but once you turn your back on her and the second things go downhill for you, that's when she turns her back and even starts laughing at you.
Right.
Hey, I gave you an out.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of things in the book that talk about how you miss your chance if you don't take wisdom when you have the opportunity to get it. Right?
I really like the ones on seeking counsel.
Okay.
And whenever you're faced with a decision, and also avoiding danger. In 22:3, a prudent man foresees evil and hides himself, but the simple pass on or punish. So just being able to foresee things that are going to happen.
Right. Very good. And I think some of those I might have had under the wisdom category, but those are good categories, the idea of some of those things. Let me quickly mention two others, so we'll have a little bit of time to talk about Ecclesiastes. One I think you'll find frequently, and you could possibly just put it under the tongue, but I think it's a little different, and that is anger. There's a lot in the book of Proverbs about anger and controlling anger and what you do with anger and the dangers of anger. Anger can be just a really devastating emotion. It can cause you to act and say and do things that you might not otherwise do when you're not in a state of rage or anger. And Proverbs talks a lot about that, so look at some of those. And then one other one, and again, because of time, we're not going to go over this. I do want to have a little bit of time to cover Ecclesiastes. And you might tie it in with some of the poverty and wealth, but that is the idea of laziness and the sluggard. I was actually surprised when I did the kind of word search. You read through, sometimes you think things pop up more. At least in the New King James, sluggard only occurs twice, and they're both in Proverbs 6. What actually occurs frequently throughout the book are talking about the lazy man, what the lazy man does. A couple of the ones that just really stand out to me, one is the one we've already talked about several times. The lazy man says, there's a lion in the streets. There's always some obstacle. If you've ever known anybody, worked with somebody, that it didn't matter what the project was. It didn't matter. There was something that was going to prevent it from happening. They just had, and maybe they had a list of things. Well, we can't do this. There's no way. We can't get through these obstacles. No matter what. There's just too much to overcome. Lazy man. Lying in the streets. Can't deal with it. The other one is where it talks about he puts his hand in the bowl and he's too weary to bring it to his mouth. So lazy, he can get his hand in the bowl, but he can't get it back up to his mouth. You ever know anybody? And again, the lazy man is not necessarily about people who don't do anything. It's again, you read the context of the lazy man, it's about things that they ought to do that they don't. There are some people who are very maybe diligent at work, very lazy at home. Or vice versa. Maybe they're diligent at home, very lazy at work. Maybe they're diligent at home and work, but they're lazy in the church. So laziness is not necessarily you're all lazy or not at all lazy. It maybe applies to various aspects of your life. Maybe you're lazy in disciplining your children. Maybe that's just something you can't find the energy to do or the willpower to do. Lots of different things which laziness can apply. All right. Very quickly, any final comments? We got about 10 minutes. Any final comments on Proverbs before we move into Ecclesiastes? Ecclesiastes is a really interesting book. It's a completely, I think in some ways, unique compared to other books of the Bible. If you read the book of Ecclesiastes, give me one or two phrases that you think are the most common phrases, or most, maybe not no most common, but most significant phrases in the book of Ecclesiastes.
All is vanity.
Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. That's one. There is another that absolutely must go with that one. And what is it? Under the sun. Under the sun. So putting those two together, what do we know about the book of Ecclesiastes and its perspective? Except for the last part of chapter 11 and chapter 12. What is the perspective of the book of Ecclesiastes? Life
On earth, without perspective of the afterlife.
Life under the sun, on the earth, without perspective to what happens beyond. And, we've already said it, what is the ultimate conclusion if this is all there is? There's nothing else. If all that we have is life under the sun, what is the conclusion? It's vanity. Why? Why is it all vanity if life under the sun is all that we have? It's mentioned several times throughout the book.
Because it's short and it ends.
It's short and it ends. The wise man dies, the rich man dies, the popular man dies, the king dies, the poor man dies, the servant dies. Stephen, you were going to add a comment?
Nothing here on its own ultimately satisfies.
Nothing on its own ultimately satisfies.
And I think it doesn't satisfy because it ends.
Right.
The idea that comes from love is eventually it will go away. And it does end, and it creates great sorrow. But that's what makes God so much better than the fact that he doesn't end. So he doesn't have any vanity, because there is no sorrow attached to him at all in any way. Because he will always be there.
Right. Exactly. Stephen?
Yeah, I was speaking really more in terms of just the needs that recur. I mean, I can get my fill of hearing, I can get full of food, but tomorrow I'm going to want to eat again, I'm going to hear again. I mean, that's the way it just keeps going. Whether or not I'm going to die or not, those things still persist every day. I'm never going to be filled with just the things here and be like, hey, I've got everything. I've got it all satisfied. Everything's there.
One of the phrases in the early part of the book especially that's interesting is there's nothing new under the sun. Now, so I said, well, of course there's something new. There's new technology, and there's new this, and there's new that. But you know what? Going back to what Stephen just said, the basic things of life don't change. I don't care what the technology is. What do we still have to do? We still have to eat. We still have to sleep. We still have to satisfy the basic needs and desires of life. And here you have a writer who has the ability. So it'd be easy for me to say, well, wealth is vanity. I've never had wealth. I've never had riches. I've never been able to say, I'm a rich man. And people say, well, that's just vanity. But the writer of the book of Ecclesiastes, presumably Solomon, says, I acquired wealth beyond what everybody else had. I acquired wisdom beyond what everybody else had. I acquired pleasure at my desire. I did all these things. I had the ability to fulfill whatever desire I want. It didn't matter. And the end result was still, it's vanity. Because no matter what I fulfilled, guess what? I'm still going to die. And the guy who didn't get to fulfill all that, he's still going to die. It's still in the end. When he takes the view under the sun, there are several passages in the book that sort of summarize what he says is the correct approach to life under the sun. Look at several of these passages with me. Chapter 2, verses 24 and 25. And the verses we're going to look at, we may not read all of them because they're very similar in their content. But he says, verse 24, there's nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? He says the best thing you can do is enjoy the moment that you're in. Another passage he'll talk about, you enjoy your wife and enjoy the blessings that you have. You see these over and over again. Chapter 3, verse 12 and 13, similar statement. I perceive there's nothing better for them to be joyful and to be good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. Again in verse 22, I thought there was nothing better than a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? And while I understand that as we come to the end of the book, there is more to life than under the sun, there is a certain amount of wisdom in this concept of enjoy the moment that you're in. Because sometimes what we do is we lose those moments because we're so busy chasing the next moment. We're so busy chasing the wealth or the education or whatever it may be that we fail to enjoy the blessings of the moment that we're in. Now, obviously, the ultimate conclusion when you get to the end of chapter 11 and go into chapter 12 begins in verse 9 of chapter 11. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are vanity. All of a sudden, I've only got 2 minutes left. Then you go in chapter 12, and he talks about what happens as you age, and the fact that you can't enjoy things the way that you did when you were younger. And he says, but you've got to have this view to eternity. You've got to have this view of life after, even from the time of your youth. Kyle?
thought it was worth mentioning that Solomon laments over and over again the unfairness or the seeming unfairness in life. And when you think about something you said earlier about there's nothing new under the sun, one of the things that's really impressive to me about the book of Ecclesiastes, kind of like the book of Proverbs, is that here we are thousands of years later and we still draw the same principal lessons from this book. It's not as if these things went out of date because
Right.
things changed so much. Our life is still the same. We still think about how there are wicked men that prosper and how unfair that seems sometimes, and how righteous people get depressed, and how sometimes we toil and see no immediate fruit from that work. You know, there's just so many things that seem unfair. Well, those unfair things are still the same today as they always were.
Right. I agree. And these books maybe stand out just like the rest of the Bible, that it's still a timeless book. But when you look at Ecclesiastes and Proverbs and these practical examinations of everyday life, just how true they still are thousands of years later. Really interesting. All right. Our time is up. The bell will ring momentarily. I appreciate it. Next week will be my last week to teach. We'll touch on Song of Solomon, and then we'll look at the first 20 chapters of the book of Isaiah. And you can't cover Isaiah very much in depth in that time, but we'll do some looking at the book of Isaiah next week. Thank you so much for your comments this morning.